lady or something.
I am.
You're not. Age is in the head. Rebbe always said age is not according to the passport. Good. Lady or something.
Yeah, okay, there should be some water.
So good to see you, Anne. How you feeling? You're here.
Oh, no.
Why only 3?
Did you fall?
How many do you have altogether? 6 that have been broken, or total 6? Well, I'm glad you're here. Let's see if we can protect the other ribs. Is Dan here? Okay, wonderful. Good. All right, let's recap what we've studied. First of all, I'd like to welcome Megan, new Kabbalah and Coffee attendee. We're going to, this is the second week of this new discourse. So I'm going to recap what we studied last week. For the most part, it was a bunch of questions. As we know, the Alter Rebbe's style is to ask a bunch of questions and then to go down various different rivers and tributaries, and then eventually we come back with the answer and learn a lot of fascinating things along the way. So the discourse is based on a Mishnah. The Mishnah says in the tractate of Megillah that on the holiday of Purim, which is coming up in less than 2 weeks, where we commemorate the victory of the Jews, the fall of Haman. Haman, you want to grab the door for him? Thank you. Oh, it's a multitasker. I like that. So Haman, who wanted to destroy the Jewish people, and through a series of miracles, the Jewish people were victorious. Haman and his sons were hung, and as the old Jewish saying goes, they wanted to kill us. We won. Let's eat. We eat on Purim Hamantashen, and we celebrate. We read the Megillah. We give gifts of food, give money to the poor, and so on and so forth. So the Mishnah says, and the fourth of the 4 traditions that we do on Purim is we feast. Towards the end of the day, we feast, and the Mishnah tells us that one is obligated to drink, to imbibe when they're feasting, to the point that one does not know the difference between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. So we can talk about what that means, but that's not the focus of the discourse. The focus of the discourse is, why is it that Purim is a holiday that gets such a major focus? The point of the Mishnah that we have to celebrate at such a level is an indication that this is a super holiday. It's such a big holiday that we have to celebrate at such a level. But what is it about Purim that elicits such a profound celebration? Because we have other holidays that commemorate miracles, like Passover, which we'll celebrate a little bit after Purim, a month after Purim, and the miracles of Passover were quite significant. Or like the splitting of the sea. Or we have the holiday of Shavuot, where we commemorate the revelation at Sinai. Those are also pretty big events. Furthermore, those are holidays that are actually holy days in the sense that we don't do work. Work is prohibited. We don't light fires. There's many things. They're like a Shabbos almost. We have some leniencies around them, but for the most part, they're like Shabbat. We have a lot of stringencies around it. So, and Purim has neither of those. In other words, Purim, the miracles at first glance are not as great as the miracles of Passover or Shavuos. And it's not a holy day in the sense that we can do work. We can drive, we can light fires, we can do all this work. So that is question number one. Question number two. At the end of the Megillah, the Megillah has a verse. And the verse says, Kimu v'kiblu haYehudim. The Jews affirmed and they accepted. So the usual style ought to be, the style of the verse ought to be that they accepted and then they affirmed, right? You accept something and then you affirm that which you accept. But here it says they affirmed and accepted. So our sages say they affirmed that which they had already accepted. What does that mean? So at Mount Sinai, the Medrash tells us that God took the mountain, he took Mount Sinai, and he picked it up over the Jewish people, and he said, you guys want my Torah? By the way, if you say no, I'm going to drop the mountain. So what would you say? You'd say yes. You don't have a choice. Here we praise the Jewish people that they said, Na'aseh v'nishma, we will do and we will hear. They didn't really have a choice. Had they said no, the mountain would have landed on them. That would have been the end of them. So how do we know that their acceptance of the Torah is sincere? In other words, you might say the fact that God kind of gave them this choice, which really wasn't a choice, but when they said yes, they didn't really mean yes. How do we know that they're sincere? So later on, years later, during the story of Purim, and the Jewish people during the story of Purim accept upon themselves to keep the Torah, despite the fact that with a very simple denial of their Jewish identity, Haman would have removed the decree. As our sages say, that the decree was against the Yehudim, it was against the Jew. It wasn't against Jewish practice. It's against the Jew. So if they denied their Jewishness, their decree would have been removed. And yet, our sages say that not one Jew had even a thought to deny their Jewish identity during this period of time. So in a sense, you can ask the question. They didn't have a choice. They would have lost their lives had they I'm sorry. The question is, I did it again. I gave the answer again. The question is, they had no choice, right? What's at stake here? What's at stake is their lives or the mountain at Mount Sinai. And now their lives here is at stake in terms of why did the decree come upon the Jews in the first place? It was because the Jewish people had turned away from God. So now the only way they're going to get out of this is by staying faithful to God, right? So they're essentially doing the same thing. They're staying faithful to God so they don't get wiped out. Just like they said yes when the mountain was over them, and so that the mountain wouldn't land on them, they would get wiped out. Right? You have to forget the answer that I gave in order to get the question. So the question is, why is the commitment during the story of Purim any greater a commitment than it was when they were standing under the mountain? One more question, and then we're going to launch into the answer. So we have question number one is why specifically Purim is a holiday that has this kind of unique instruction to celebrate at such a great level. Number two, why is it that the commitment to Torah during the story of Purim is any greater a commitment than it was at the time of Mount Sinai? Question number three. Our sages say that fortunate is one who comes to the next world, and they come bearing with them their Torah study. In other words, fortunate is one who studied Torah in this world. The question is, the Garden of Eden in the next world, you have a revelation of the divine light. That's what it is. Our sages say that what happens in the next world, the souls sit there and they bask in the glory of the divine presence. So why do I need to take Torah from here when I got God himself over there? Right? What's the upside of taking the Torah from here when I have divine revelation up there? That's question number one within this question. Number two, it says that one who has the ability to study Torah and does not, so there's severe consequences for it. So the Rebbe's question is that seemingly You got a copy? You have last week's copy. Good morning. So the question is as follows. One who doesn't have time to study Torah is exempt would study one chapter in the morning, one chapter in the evening. But if we evaluate, if we contrast, somebody who doesn't have time to study Torah gets away with one chapter in the morning, one chapter in the evening. And the one who does have a chance to study Torah and doesn't study Torah, he has some really severe consequences of kares, which is a spiritual cutting off, a premature death, whatever. But it seems like a really extreme contrast, right? So what this third question really wants to understand is what is the greatness of Torah on this earth? Why do we make such a big deal out of it? Right? We know it's the identity of the Jewish people is connected to Torah, but these are specific examples that kind of beg the question: what's the greatness of Torah that we make such a big deal out of it? Okay, so in order to answer this, on page 12, we began the following discussion. I'll read the text again, even though we started it last time, so we get the flow. Page 12. These above concepts will be understood through understanding why the Torah is called the primeval or primordial analogy. Okay, the Torah, right, the 5 books of Moses, is an analogy for the primordial. You want to know God? Read the Torah. You read the Torah, like if I give you a parable about an idea, you understand the idea from the parable. You want to understand God? Read the Torah. That's the parable. Like it says in the prophet, we went through this story before that King David, when he had the opportunity to kill Saul, and instead of killing Saul, he just cut the corner of his cloak, which he received a consequence for. If you remember, at the end of his life, he suffered from cold. It was always cold. I mean, I think a lot of old people feel that, but he was particularly cold, and we have the whole story in the prophet, how he got warm and so on, but that's a conversation for another time. But when Saul confronted him, King David said to Saul, I never had any ill intent. It's from the wicked that wickedness comes forth, not from good people. So we see there's like a parable that's being told to us in the text. And what's the parable? The parable is, we actually read this yesterday in the Torah. It says that God caused it to occur to him. The Talmud tells us that when you find a person in an inn and he's climbing up a ladder, and then the ladder falls, and there's a person underneath the ladder, and the person underneath the ladder gets killed. So what's the story here? Who are these people? So the person underneath the ladder is someone who murdered intentionally. He killed someone intentionally, but there were no witnesses. Because there were no witnesses, so therefore you can't give him the consequences. In Jewish law, we're very stringent. The guy who's on the ladder killed unintentionally. So the guy on the ladder is in a situation where he kills and also no witnesses. So here he kills, again, unintentionally, the person who is underneath the ladder. This time he has to go into exile. The Torah tells us that there are 6 cities of refuge in the land of Israel, 3 on the other side of the Jordan. And when someone kills unintentionally, until their hearing is heard, they have to go to a safe space. Otherwise, the family members have a right to kill them. So what ends up happening here is this person who already did evil, even if it was unintentional, God brings it to his hand to do evil again. From the wicked comes forth wickedness. And conversely, from the righteous comes forth righteousness. But we see the association between King David's comment to Saul. He says, as the primordial analogy tells us, from the wicked come forth wickedness, which is a reference to the Torah that tells us that God brings the wickedness into the hands of the wicked. Whether you got that or not is not so important. That was a little bit of a Talmudic analysis, but the main point is that when we read the Torah, we are reading a parable. That's not to say that we're not reading an actual story, right? I can tell you an analogy can be an actual story, but its intention is to explain something else. The Torah is an actual story, but it's telling us something about God. I'll deviate for another second because this is a good example. We've been studying in the Talmud course. So the end of last class, there was a conversation that took place between two rabbis, a rabbi and his father-in-law, and he saw that his father-in-law was leaning against the wall and he was in a pleasant mood. So he saw that he could ask his father-in-law any questions. So he asked him, why is it that when the animals go out to pasture, the goats go first and the sheep go after? Goats generally are more dark colored skin. The sheep are generally more light colored skin. So he says that's the way of the world, that the darkness precedes light. End the conversation. That's what he said. So just like it is that in the creation we find it was evening, it was day one day, or we see that first it says that the darkness was on the face of the earth, and then God said, let there be light. So we see the darkness comes before light. So therefore, that's the way of the world. The dark sheep go out, the dark goats go out first, and the sheep follow them. So that's a mushal, that's a parable. What's the parable for? It's a fact. That's the way it works. I'm not a shepherd, but I'm taking the Talmud's word. That's how sheep and goats go out to shepherd together, pasture together. But what's really the story here? The real story here is that life works a certain way. And life works in a manner where you experience darkness before you experience light. You face challenge. If you ever want to experience success, you got to go to the darkness first, right? What's the saying? What's the way to the light? It's through the darkness. Nobody ever achieved anything of great value in this life without working very hard at it. And when you're in the darkness, you can fall apart, or you can remember that there's light if I just push through. So here you have this conversation in the Talmud that really is a parable for life. It's an analogy for life. So all of Torah is really an analogy for the divine, for the primordial being, for God. Another example of this, it says, V'chein Shlomo Melech, King Solomon, on page 13, of blessed memory, says, Amar lahavin mashul melitza. He uses the term in the book of Proverbs. He says to understand analogies and parables. What does that mean, analogies and parables? So he's saying that the Torah is analogies and parables. To understand it, that's the function of the book of Proverbs, is to understand those analogies and parables. To explain what does this really mean? When we say the primeval or the primordial, what are we talking about? We're talking about the primary being of the world. We're talking about God. The primordial being is the infinite light itself. So the word kadmoni, primordial, comes from the Hebrew word kodem, which means before or prior to, right? So what we have here is that you have this, the Torah is an analogy for the light of the infinite one himself. Now, what does that mean, the light of the infinite one himself? So as we've discussed many times, we have various different manifestations of the divine. Not to use the human being as a perfect example, but we have who we are, and then we have what we express. And what we express also has many layers. There's what we express to ourselves. There's what we express to the outside. If you read my email this week, or if you listened to my sermon the last Shabbos or two, we talk about the idea that there's a true self. There's a self that I have as a narrative of myself, and then there's a self that is adopted from the way I perceive you thinking about me, right? And that's very elementary, but those are three basic ideas that we see already a profound distinction in expressions of self, right? I'm teaching now, so you're getting a combination of some of my intellect and some of my emotion. You're definitely not getting all of my intellect and all of my emotion, because it's not humanly possible to share all of that, right? When I give someone a hug, they maybe are getting a deeper expression of my emotion. If I give someone a kiss, they're getting a deeper expression of my emotion, right? When I'm praying, I show up with a different manifestation of self. So we have a lot of layers of expression. And then there's what goes on inside of myself. There's when I'm thinking about myself or for myself, even if I'm thinking about Torah, but I'm thinking it within my head, or if I'm feeling something inside my heart and I'm not expressing it outwardly, right? So all of these are different layers of expression. So God has also layers of expression. And all of this is going to lead us to understand what it means when we say that the Torah is an analogy for the infinite light of the Ein Sof, the infinite light of the infinite one. Page 14. Ki bechina soivev kol almin, umemale kol almin, zeu ma shenimshach mimenu yizbarach ha'ara liyis chayis la'olamais. So, very briefly, because we've done this many, many times, the dimension of the divine light, which is called sovev kol almin, which means the encompassing light of all the worlds, right? And this is the dimension of God that encompasses all of existence, the physical, the spiritual, the most lofty of worlds, all are encompassed collectively by the divine light, which means that all of it is equal before the encompassing energy. When you have a circle that circles something, everything inside the circle is encompassed by the circle. So in a sense, everything inside the circle is equal in regards to the circle. So here we're talking about a divine energy, the divine energy that encompasses all of existence. Everything inside that area that's encompassed is all equal before the divine presence. That's how lofty, that's how profound the divine light is, that everything inside of it is equal. By the way, it's interesting because we have experiences in life where we live in a place where all the little details are very important, right? You walk into a room, you want to make sure the chairs are straight, tablecloths are clean, photocopies are where they need to be, right? Everything, make sure you came on time. Everything is orderly. But you can then have a moment, an experience where you hear some news that touches you to the core. And when you hear that news that touches you to the core, you can say, I could care less about any of this. None of that makes any difference, right? It could be good news, and God forbid, it could be bad news. You think about, we all remember where we were on October 7th. And, when you heard that news, nothing was important. Nothing, all those details were insignificant because something so stark, something so raw, something so dark was exposed. Everything became insignificant. Or conversely, in a positive way, when you experience such beautiful news, it says this analogy is brought down in Chassidus a lot. It says that a father at his only child's wedding tolerates even his enemy, right? You can be at your only child's wedding, and this person that you dislike comes into the room, and you'll dance with them also. Tomorrow, not a chance. Yesterday, not a chance. But right now, middle of the wedding, the joy is so exposed that you say, these details are not significant. Actually, there's an individual that I have, unfortunately, I have a conflict with, and I went to someone else's house who knows both of us, and they were sitting shiva, and it was very raw. The person sitting shiva. And when I got up to leave, I gave him a hug. And as I gave him a hug, this other person walked into the room. So as he's hugging me, he says, maybe the two of you could finally get this thing resolved. And I understood where he was coming from. He understands the circumstances, but he's in a place of rawness. So therefore, he says, your issues are not that important. They're not important. We're dealing with death here. We're dealing with loss. We're dealing with tragic loss. Your issues are not that important. And by the way, he's right. He's right. He's 100% right. Not 80% right. He's 100% right. But we don't live in that space. If we lived in that space, we live in a messianic world, right? We don't live in that space. By the way, we don't live in that space divinely as well. The divine light that equalizes everything encompasses the world. That's not the light that fills the world. And the reason why it doesn't fill the world is because if that encompassing light filled the world, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't have a self-consciousness. So in order for us to have a self-consciousness, there has to be a filter on that powerful light. I mean, think about it. Think about that moment of terrible news or that moment of great news, you can't stay in that space. You'd be paralyzed. In other words, how the chairs are set and the photocopies and coming on time, those are real. They're real in the sense that in a physical, finite world where we're here to accomplish something, you need those structures around us. If we lived in a transcendent world, great, we wouldn't need that stuff. But we don't live in a transcendent world. We were put in this finite world to accomplish something. So you need that structure. But we also need to, on occasion, tap into the transcendent to help us put things in perspective. That these things, while they're important, they're not really that important. They're only important because we live within that finite reality, but our job is to move past that. This makes sense? This registering? Less or more?
How pointless for us in this world if we can just say, okay, chair, move there, book, move there, like just in our heads. Kind of like whatever happened doesn't need to be done physically.
Right.
That's the property of this world is if you want something done,
You got to do it. You got and the details become important. We were talking about at the Kiddush yesterday that God is in the details. Were you speaking about that? Yeah, God is in the details. Right? The world says the devil is in the details. That's not true. God is in the details. God wants things a very specific way. Because if he didn't, if it was the devil in the details, then we wouldn't live in a detailed world. We live in a very fragmented world because that's where life is lived. But we have to, the value of the fragmentation is only of value when we contextualize it. And the contextualization of the fragmentation is that all of it is an expression of the divine. So we have to move between these two realities, that on the one hand, there's a divine light that encompasses everything, and then there's a divine light that fills everything. The divine light that fills everything is where every single creation is given a very specific form of energy, quantity, quality, right? The coffee gets what coffee needs, and the water gets what the water needs, and the chair, and you can't interchange them. If the animal, if the sheep got the lion's energy, it'd go a little crazy. I mean, think about it. When we have too much energy, we're a little nuts. And we don't have enough energy, we can't do, right? So we need just the right amount of energy, 110 into 110 and not into 220, and 220 not into 110. One's going to explode and the other one's not going to work. You have to have the right balance. I told you that story with the haircut, the 220 and the 110. I've never told the story. No? Okay, I'll say it real quickly. So first time I went to Russia in 92. So we were 15 Americans coming to the newly fallen Soviet Union to a city right outside of Kiev called Bucha. Unfortunately, during this war, they found mass graves in Bucha. But Bucha was a little village, literally a little village. And we showed up to the camp. None of us spoke Russian. And 250 kids get off the bus, a bunch of Jewish kids that are just coming out of the world of communism. And these were our charges for the next 8 weeks. Anyway, it was a fun Wild West kind of experience. But one of the things somebody brought, this was also I think my first time really out of the United States. Somebody brought a haircut machine. Well, you're going to need a haircut over the summer. So it's a 110, right? Now, when you travel internationally, you take a computer, it's a built-in converter. All you need is an adapter, right? But then you needed an actual converter to convert the energy coming out of the wall at a 220 so that it gets narrowed into a 110. But what do we know? So I was the first sacrifice. And we actually decided, so in Chabad, we don't take what we call baldies. In other Hasidic groups, they shave their head and they just keep their payas. But in Chabad, we take a normal, balanced haircut. So I say normal for us, right? Whatever other people think is crazy. But anyway, so I decided I was going to do a baldy. It'll grow back by the time I get back to New York, back to yeshiva, it'll be back. So the guy giving the haircut, and for fun, we were going to do those are the days of Mr. T. Remember Mr. T? So I was going to do a mohawk. So they started the haircut. He took off one side, started on the other side, And then he says, wow, this thing is hot. So all he did was an adapter. He didn't put in a converter. He said, oh my gosh, this thing is smoking. And then it popped. So now I was literally studying. This was at night. Anyway, the next morning, I went to town, to the little village to find the barber. And I walked into the barber shop. And there's a little short guy there, little older guy. And I said to him, like, I didn't want him to cut my sideburns. Jew needs to keep the sideburns, keep the payas. So I said to him in my Russian that I had just started learning, I said, Eta snat, which means this cut off. Eta nitroget, don't touch this. So he says to me in Russian, he says, Tichochish tolka payas? You want to have only payas? Turns out he was Jewish. And he knew what payas were. So he said, you want to have only payas? He said to me the Hebrew word. So anyway, that was that's my 22110 and how I found a Jewish barber in Bucha. Anyway, so everything's got to have the right type of energy, right? In how the divine energy fills the world, it's very specific, very intentional, and it doesn't work unless it's the structure that God put in place. Okay. So that's on page 14, the level of divine light known as Soiviv Kolaman, encompassing the world, and Mamali Kolaman, filling the world. The light that fills the world is the light that God radiates downward to infuse the world with life. So by definition, if the light is able to be received, that means that there's a relationship between the recipient and the light itself, right? If my son-in-law was explaining to my grandson yesterday how he wanted to know how a balloon works, a helium balloon works. So he says that helium is lighter than oxygen, right? If you want water goes in a cup. If I put acid in here, it's going to burn the cup, right? So if the cup is holding the liquid, that means they have a relationship. They're relative to each other. The liquid may be more valuable, but the cup can hold it, right? So if there's two things, one thing is a recipient of the other, that means the other is being manifested or delivered in a way that is relative to the recipient. The haircut machine, that's a 110, that's drawing from a 110, the energy works for a 110. The machine itself can receive it. Now, if it was a 220 drawing from a 110, or let's do it the other way around, as we did, a 220 trying to generate energy into a 110, the energy is not relative. It's relative just a little, very little bit. But ultimately, the relationship is not a good one because the vessel cannot actually receive the energy that's coming to it. So if we look around the world and we see that we are operational, we're functional, the table's standing, the chair's standing, the coffee is not going anywhere, that means that the energy, the divine energy that's energizing everything is relative to the world that receives it. Now, by the way, as you go through the upper worlds, right, if we lived in the world of the angels, the divine light, we wouldn't be able to be humans there because we wouldn't be able to have a self-consciousness and be able to receive that level of divine light. But angels could. Angels could receive it because they're loftier beings. So therefore, they're able to receive that light and function. But their function is the function of an angel, not the function of a human. They can only function as an angel. So they also receive the divine light relative to their level of capacity, right? So he says that even the encompassing light also has a relationship to the worlds that it is encompassing. However, because by definition, if it's encompassing it, it means that it has a connection to it, right? And it does generate life to the worlds, but it's not in intimate life. It's not an intimate energy. The energy that's being manifest from the encompassing light needs to go through a filter. So the difference between the encompassing manifestation of the divine and the inner manifestation of divine is whether that energy comes to us in an encompassing manner or if that energy comes to us in an internal manner. Make sense so far? We're talking about divine manifestation. You want to have a question? Go ahead.
Trying to wrap my head, what do these three questions have in common? You said foreign versus the other ones. Why is it such a simcha? The other one is we confirmed and then accepted. The third question is the Torah is a prelude to Hashem. And I guess we have other questions on that. I'm just trying to see where are we going with this?
I have no idea.
I'm just trying to people.
We're just getting started. You have to, when you learn Chassidus, you have to file the questions away. Keep them in your back pocket. And this is how it works. We're going down a river. We may go down a side river and then rejoin the river. But eventually, when we get to the end, all the answers are just going to come into focus. The job is to be present in what we're studying now so that you really understand the subject matter. So then, when the answer comes into focus, it's all clear. It's a unique approach. Okay? So we'll get there. Be patient. It might take a couple of months, but we'll get there. Yes?
Thinking of one of these as higher in some way than the other, I'm comparing Mamala to Sovereign.
Great question. Great question. So the question is, what do you mean by higher?
Like you said, I'm not so sure. I don't know what I mean by higher.
So there's higher meaning it's a greater expression of God, or higher can mean a more difficult to receive. And the answer is that in Yiddish there's a saying, "Svenzach meret." Depends what you're talking about, because the upside of the light that's internalized is that it's internalized.
That's Mamala.
That's Mamali. We actually experience God in an intimate way because God shows up for us in an intimate way. In that regard, the encompassing light is abstract. It's out there. So the upside of the Mamali, of the light that fills the world, is that we experience it in an intimate way. The downside is that it's not so profound. By definition, the fact that I can internalize it means it's not so profound, right? You want to compare the water that's in the cup to the water that's in the urn, right? If I turn the urn upside down, most of it would spill on the floor, and maybe I'd get enough in my cup, right? So there's a lot more in the urn than's going into my cup. My cup's only a vessel for 1 cup worth of the liquid. God's light is so much greater than what is coming into the cup, what we're experiencing. So in that regard, that's a disadvantage, right? The advantage is that it's an intimate relation. The disadvantage is that well, let's break it down again. The advantage of Mamale is that it's intimate. The disadvantage of Mamale is that it's very limited. Let's go to Soiviv. The upside of Soiviv is that it's very profound. So it's a much greater expression of God's experience. The downside is you can't really internalize it, right? Next week, not next Shabbos, but the Shabbos after, we're going to read about the sin of the golden calf, right? So what happened? The Jewish people stood at Sinai. They experienced the divine revelation. It was not a Mamale revelation. It was not an internal revelation. It was a very encompassing revelation. And because it was an encompassing revelation, it didn't impact them to the point that 40 days later, they were able to worship an idol, right? So the upside is that Mount Sinai was a transformative event for humanity, for the Jewish people, for all of time. The downside is it wasn't internalized. So there is some benefit from that, a very powerful one, but it's not a personalized experience. And when God gave the second tablets, it says that it came with all the commentaries and so on. So now it can be disseminated. We can internalize. We can digest it. So again, let's use a human comparison. When we express ourselves in a relationship with profound love, that's beautiful. It's very powerful. It's very life affirming, right? You know, it's a very strong and important part of the experience. But that doesn't do the dishes. That doesn't take the garbage out, right? the Mimale expression of love is sweeping the floor, taking the garbage out, doing the dishes. Is it so profound? No, it's not this earth-shattering love. But on the other hand, it's a very real, tangible expression of love. So everything has an upside. Everything's necessary. We need the encompassing light and we need the internal light in order for us to function in the way that God wants. If there was only the internal light and not the encompassing light, there would be a very big distance between us and God. And we wouldn't be able to relate to anything divine. So it's in fact the fact that we have encompassing light that we can even have a relationship with God in the intimate way. Make sense? Okay, so that's all God, expressions of God. Page 15, but God himself, God's essence, God's essential being, is not, it transcends the entire spiritual cosmos entirely. We can't talk about God's essence as being encompassing or filling. It's beyond that. God is beyond those descriptors. Does the sun come into your house? The sun doesn't come into your house. The light of the sun comes into your house. If the sun came into your house, it'd burn your house down. The light of the sun comes into your house. And it's not even the light of the sun, it's the light of the sun. And it's however many thousands of light years away from the sun by the time it arrives here. Right? So the light that we experience of the sun is an expression of the sun. It's not the sun itself. The sun is made up of gases and whatnot. We don't have gases coming through the window. We have light. The light is an expression of the sun. And the higher you go, the more profound it is. By the way, sunlight in general is more aligned with the encompassing light than the filling light. Because the sun doesn't take you into consideration at all, ever. It just does its thing. So we as a recipient need to align ourselves. You want a plant to grow, you got to make sure it's receiving the sunlight. If you want to get the vitamin D, you got to go outside, right? We can receive from the sun, but by the way, within limit, right? If you don't put on sunscreen, you're going to get burned. Right? So everything's got a limit, everything's got an expression. But anyway, I don't want to get distracted. But the point is that God himself, God's essence, it transcends any kind of descriptors of encompassing or filling. God's essence is so much higher than that. So therefore, how do we call God? We call him Kadmon Shalaylam. We call him the primary being of the world. Or the prime mover. Right? God is the prime, it's beyond description. So the Torah, which is called the primordial, the primeval analogy, is a analogy for that primary being. In other words, since God is the primary being, because we're not giving him any descriptors, we're just calling him the primary being, and we're saying that the Torah is an analogy for the primary being. So now that we understand that the primary being is God, so the Torah is the primordial, the primeval analogy. Just as through an analogy, one grasps the analog, page 16, right? When I tell you a story about the three bears, I'm trying to teach you something. I'm not trying to tell you a story about the three bears. I'm trying to teach you something. That when you sit down to eat, you should make sure the food's not too hot and it's not too cold and that it's just right. Right? So what's my point here? I'm trying to convey an intellectual idea or maybe even a practical idea. But how do I do it? I tell you a story. Okay, at least you tell the 2-year-old. So the Torah is telling us a story. It's telling us an analogy so that we can understand through that the concept of God. So so we're going to address part of the question, one of the questions that we asked, we're going to touch on it. So when one has acquired Torah, right? When you've acquired Torah, so it says like this. I'll give you the punchline. It says like this, that when we leave this world and we come to the Garden of Eden and we're experiencing something, We're experiencing divine revelation. We're experiencing the revelation of God. What are you experiencing? How do you know what to experience? How do you know how to experience it? If you have no knowledge of God, then what you're experiencing is foreign to you. Right? If you've studied Torah, and have we just established that Torah is an analogy about God, so the more Torah study you study, the more you know about God. And even though the revelation is so much more profound than what you're experiencing down here, but because you studied the analogy, you say, that's what that is. You have familiarity with the subject matter because you spent your life in this world studying Torah. So that's what it says. Fortunate is one who comes to the next world and is carrying with them the Torah study from this world. Because when we study Torah in this world, we acquired a familiarity. I'll give you an example of this. I can describe. Let's say you go to the reason why I give this analogy is because when I was a child, we always talked about the Grand Canyon. I never went to it, but as an adult, a few years ago, we went to the Grand Canyon. Right? Anybody here been to the Grand Canyon? No. So Grand Canyon is one of the great wonders, right? It's an amazing, beautiful. So if you were to take a year and study about the Grand Canyon, you read all the science books, all the geography books, and all of the whatever else is it, not gemology, but what's the study of stones? Geology, that's geology. And then you go and you come to the Grand Canyon, you still don't know what you're looking at. I mean, the mystery is so great, but it comes into focus. Oh, that's what we're talking about. That's the experience, right? There's familiarity now. When you study Torah, we're studying about God. We're trying to comprehend the divine. By the way, we just did it right now. This is not an abstract theory about studying Torah. We're studying Torah, right? You're going to go about your day today and you're going to encounter something. Especially now you're going to encounter, because it's like talking about the pink elephant, right? But especially now, you're going to go out there today, you're going to have some kind of interaction, and you're going to say, oh, that's God's memali. That's God as he fills the world. I get that this is a very tailor-made experience. How do I know that? Because when we process experiences in our lives with a knowledge that God is orchestrating things, that we're not living in a vacuum, that God is orchestrating what it is that we're experiencing God as he's immanent, as God is manifest within our consciousness. If God was only abstract, if God was only encompassing, then things would be chaotic. In truth, I don't mean they may feel very chaotic right now, but I'm saying in truth, they would be chaotic. Like it's a jungle. But because we know that God is present, we just studied it. So when you have a particular interaction, you're going to say, what was this for? What was the purpose of this? Can I unpack it? Is there some lesson I can take from this? It's like, well, who cares what kind of lesson you're taking from it? It just happened. No, it didn't just happen. God orchestrated it. There's a reason for it. Let me see if I can figure out how the reason might apply to me in my life. So you're studying something, and then it becomes relevant. You're finding God in your experience. It's not just an intellectual exercise. How much more so if you spend a lifetime studying Torah, and then you come to the next world and you actually experience the divine light in a very real way. You're familiar with what it is that you're experiencing. This is familiar. I've seen this before. I saw it in the books. I studied it in the books. I know the analogy. That's what that is. You get it? Does it make sense? You're having a hard time with it. You got it. Good. So he goes a little further. He digs into this just a little bit deeper. That when we talk, so let me just take a minute and give some context. I don't want to take it for granted that everybody knows this. So in our tradition, we have something called the next world, the olam haba, the world to come. There are two worlds to come. One world to come is a world to come in space, meaning it's there already. Our goal is to get to that world. That is a world to come. A world to come in space. Downstairs. Upstairs. So a world to come in space. And that is the Garden of Eden. And then there's a world to come in time. The world to come in time is the Messianic era. Right? Our tradition tells us, we just studied this in the closing of the book of Maimonides, that when the time is right, the Mashiach comes, the ingathering of exiles, war and famine are removed from the earth, the divine presence is present, no more war. The occupation of all mankind is to know God, and so on and so forth. That's the Messianic era. That's the ultimate. But until the Messianic era, when a person dies, their soul leaves their body and goes to the next world, which is there presently. And that world has what's known as Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden. There's also a purgatory place in the next world, which is a cleansing process for anybody who's not worthy of going directly into the world of Gan Eden, to paradise. They go through a cleansing process so that they are then worthy to go into Gan Eden, to the Garden of Eden, to this world of paradise. What happens in that world? So, and by the way, when we say that world, it's right here. It's not like you get on a rocket ship and go 1,000,000 miles. It's present. It's a different dimension, right? All of godliness is totally present here. We just use terms of over there and over here because we're finite beings. But the Garden of Eden is present right here. We just don't have the frequency to see it because our bodies actually hide that. But when the soul leaves the body, it enters into that different dimension. And depending on the person's life in this world, and depending on God's intention for that soul, will determine how much the frequency gets turned on. Right? Do they get to go into the lower level of paradise, the Garden of Eden? Do they go into a middle level, a higher level? And in fact, there are myriads of levels in the Garden of Eden. In a general sense, we call it Gan Eden HaTachton and Gan Eden HaElyon. The lower Gan Eden and the higher Gan Eden. The lower Garden of Eden and the higher Garden of Eden. Okay? That's your Garden of Eden and world to come education for today. So he says like this, page 17. I'm sorry, back on bottom of 16. So we just established that the Torah is an analogy for the upper world, for the presence of the divine, so that when a person goes into the next world, they're experiencing the divine presence based on the knowledge, on the analogy that they already experienced. In the study of Torah, there are infinite levels of comprehension. That's understood. Be'ilu achar ilu, ascending upward one level after another, right? Again, this is very basic. A person, when you study Torah as a 2-year-old or as a 25-year-old or as somebody who studied Torah their whole lives and they're an 80-year-old, their knowledge of Torah is very profoundly different and distinct. And if we lived endless, we would constantly learn Torah deeper. By the way, if you read the Torah portion every week, every year you read it, you get new insight, right? Even just in the basic story. Why? Because we're a little bit more mature, we have a little bit more knowledge, a little bit more experience. We see in the story, we see a deeper layer, right? This is a very basic example of this, let alone if you spend your time studying the commentaries and meditating on it and studying other Torah and then bringing all the comparisons together, there's infinite levels of comprehension. So if that's the case in Torah study itself, so when we are comprehending the divine in the world to come, there is the comprehension as it lives in the lower Garden of Eden, and there's the comprehension as it lives in the higher Garden of Eden. And what I didn't explain, which I should have, is that what goes on in this Garden of Eden, what is in this world to come, right? In the afterlife. So the true reality of everything is the divine presence, right? We only think that there's something else going on, but the true reality of everything is the divine presence. And in this world, we struggle to see in the physicality the presence of the divine. We try to sift through what we're experiencing to understand the divine presence in the world. When we're no longer limited by the body, when the body no longer, when I say the body, there's no voices in our head telling us, no, that's not a godly experience. We don't have any of our narrative that limits our ability to, like a child who lets go and just accepts the truth that they're experiencing, right? We as adults, we already have a lot of voices that are talking to us and being cynical and telling us, to frame our experiences. But when we're no longer restricted by that, then we move into this different dimension where we're experiencing God. And the reward for our life in this world is going to be commensurate with how we lived in this world, is how much of that divine consciousness are we going to have in the next world? If we lived a good life, then by definition, the filters are fewer, or you could say they're more. The point is we get to experience more of the divine experience, less being caught up with ourselves, and more of the divine experience. So we may experience that in the lower Gan Eden, the lower Garden of Eden, if we were okay. And if we were great in this world, we go to the higher Garden of Eden. And even souls that have passed on, it says that every Rosh Chodesh, the first of each month, they ascend. Every Shabbos, they ascend. On the anniversary of their birthday, they ascend. On the anniversary of their yard site, they ascend. So souls can climb based on a structure that God put in place. They can't do anything to grow themselves. That's the difference. In this world, we can actually grow. We have the choice to grow. In the world to come, we don't get that choice. We move when God tells us to move. But as we move, we get to experience God in a higher dimension. So, if studying the Torah in this world is an analogy for the higher world, for the divine, now you enter into the higher world and you're in the lower place in the higher world. What you're studying there ultimately is an analogy for that which is higher than it. Right? The more you study, the more analogies you bring in. The more analogies you bring in, the more you understand the subject matter. I think he says this here. Yeah, he's going to say it in a minute. I'll give you a preview because we got to wrap up. But he tells us, who was the wisest of all men? King Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech. What made him so wise? The Talmud asks, what was King Solomon's wisdom? So King Solomon's wisdom, the Talmud says, is that he was able to give 3,000 analogies on any concept. Give you 3,000 parables. So if you think about it for a second, he's a great storyteller. Right? He was able to give you 3,000 stories to explain a concept. Okay, that sounds profound, but it doesn't sound so profound. I mean, if I had enough time, I can give you 3,000 stories also. Right? That's not his greatness. It's not the 3,000 analogies. It's not even that the 3,000 analogies were all aligned up with every point of the concept that he's trying to explain. The greatness is that at each analogy, you got to understand the subject matter more deeply. So when you started with number 3,000, you heard the analogy and said, wow, that's a pretty profound idea. Great. You think you know the idea? Let's do 2,999. Give you another analogy. Now you understand that analogy, you understand the subject matter even greater. And you keep on going, and every layer that you climb in these analogies, you're getting deeper into the teaching. So ultimately, his greatness is not just that he can tell you 3,000 stories. The greatness is that each story helped us get deeper into the intellectual idea that he was trying to convey. And if the idea here is ultimately a comprehension of godliness, so as we went deeper and deeper in these 3,000 analogies, we get closer and closer to a comprehension of the divine, a connection to the divine.
Hello,
Yes,
I kind of have a question. I don't really know. To present the question.
give me an analogy. No, I'm just kidding.
I mean, I'm having a hard time in a sense. Asking you the question about what's rolling around in my head. And at the bottom of page 16, the quote, God looked into the Torah
Mhm.
and created the world. And I've got this image, well, God sitting there and he picks up the Torah's already made, and he's saying, well, we've got to do this, we've got to do this, that.
Okay, what's about
Is
what?
that a reasonable, if you will, interpretation of?
That, yeah, so the answer is yes and no, right? Yes, because that's what it means, but it doesn't necessarily, God doesn't have a Torah scroll and looks in a Torah scroll. What is the Torah? The Torah is what is a blueprint? A blueprint is a guide so that everything ends up exactly where it's supposed to be. When we're talking about this dimension of God, we're not talking about God's essence, because God's essence transcends Torah. We're talking about Torah. It's like saying, I'm gonna explain your discomfort. Okay, you have an architect that makes a blueprint, and then let's say the architect is also the general contractor. The architect draws the blueprint, and then the architect himself looks in his blueprint to go then build the house. You say, what does he need to look at the blueprint? He wrote the blueprint. Because the blueprint was the artist's intention for the house. So God wrote the Torah, or it's more appropriate to say that the Torah is an expression of God at the dimension that God wants the world to function. Because God transcends the Torah, and our connection to God transcends the Torah. But within the framework of the Torah, as it is a blueprint for the world, God looked into the Torah in order to create the world according to that intention. Now, does it literally mean that God looked into the Torah before he created the world? It doesn't necessarily need to mean that. What's more important is, from our vantage point, to recognize that everything that is in creation roots itself back into Torah. That's the important part. So that we look at our life experience and understand that this has its origins directly in the Torah. I'll tell you an interesting story. So there was a rabbi that taught this to his students. This goes back a couple hundred years. And the students said, come on, that's nonsense. It's nonsense. God looked into the Torah and created the world. Everything is aligned in Torah. And he left observant Judaism. Some years later, he encountered his teacher again. And his teacher said to him, why did you abandon your faith? So he said, because you made this statement, you made this teaching that everything that's found in the world is rooted in Torah. So he says, well, it is. So he says, well, tell me where my name is found in Torah, where I am found in Torah. So he quoted a verse to him from the Song of the Sea. It says, no, it's not from the Song of the Sea. It's from the Song of Haazinu. Oh man.
Oh, wherever.
No. I want to tell it to you. Okay, here we go. It was actually Nachmanides who had that student. So here it says, Amarti Afeim Ashpisa Me'enosh Zichram, which means I said in my anger, let's say I translate, I, God, said in my heart that I would scatter them, causing their memory to cease from mankind. That those that defy God's word, that God's will, Nachmanides, the Ramban, Nachmanides told his student that 4,000 years of history and millions of names are compressed into the Torah. So he said, how's that possible? So he quoted this verse. So he said, if you look at those words, the middle letter, the third letter of each of those words spells out those 5 words. Amarti afem ashpisa me'enish zichram. The third letter of each of those words spells out the name of the student, Reb Avner. His name was Avner. So the student, wow, he freaked out. Like, I messed this whole thing. I went on a whim. So he asked the teacher, like, how is there any hope for me? So he said that the verse itself has provided a solution, that you have to go scatter, you have to go travel, you have to go exile yourself, and in the process of exile, you'll remove God's anger. I think this point is the teaching of the Rebbe, if I'm not mistaken, but the Rebbe says that in that verse itself, we see the solution, because it doesn't spell Avner, it says Reb Avner, Reish Avner, Rabbi Avner. In other words, God was saying in the Torah that even this person who on the outside seems to have run away from his faith, God still sees him as in his potentiality, as a rabbi, as a rav. So just interesting. But the point here is that you have a Torah that was given to the Jewish people before this story a couple thousand years, and in the Torah is this guy, right? And again, I want to qualify what I'm about to say. I don't need these proofs for me. Like, my faith in God and Torah is intact, but we do have these kind of things. There's in more recent times, they have the Bible codes, where they fed the Torah into a computer, and the computer puts out all kinds of interesting historical facts that can be extrapolated from letters of the Torah, and different, interesting things, which again just affirms that which we already know, that the Torah is the blueprint for creation. That's a long-winded answer to your short question. All right. Next week, to be continued. We're going to be actually